One of the popular topics circulating in our world right now, and it is of great concern, is the issue of the rising anti-Semitism, the phenomenon of the rising anti-charedim sentiment, particularly in this last period of time, in this last year, in this COVID era, which is of great concern and begs really some understanding of this issue, because this is a time in COVID where people are trying to be good to each other. You know, mankind is reaching out to each other. The world, it's an affliction that affects everybody. Nobody is spared from it. And there's a feeling and a sentiment of trying to be good to one another, trying to save mankind. And there is a feeling that we have to combat racism and any kind of hatred and negativity. And it's very widespread. And yet, in the midst of this COVID era, there's this terrible rise of anti-Semitism, and particularly anti-charedim sentiment from the world at large, and even from in our own confines. And why? Why is that? Why is this occurring? You know, I live in Canada. In Canada, you dare not harm a raccoon. And chas v'sholom that you would dare to harm a beaver. But for some reason, it's not unacceptable to have these anti-charedim sentiments. Why is that? Now, of course, there's things that we should be doing better. There are things that everybody should be doing better. Of course, there are things that we have to improve on as charedim, as a nation, as a people. There are things that the whole world has to improve on. Why are we being singled out? So there's great discussion amongst the different thinkers, etc., about why is this and what we should be doing and how we should do things differently and how we explain ourselves, and people don't understand us and they don't understand our community. Let's take a step backward. And we're now in the Chag of Pesach. Let's examine Shlit Pesach. Shlit Pesach and Yetzias Mitzrayim and the Chag of Pesach. We say in the Haggadah, we say in the Baruch Shem Haftarchos Yisrael. We give Shevach Haidah to the Rebbeinu Shalom. He kept his promise. He kept his promise to us that in the Bris Bein Absorim, Chishev Esaketz, Va'avon V'inu Esam Arba Me'oi Shana, that there will be this Shibud 400 years, Va'achrei Chen Yetzu B'Rechush Gadol, and then they will be redeemed and they will go out B'Rechush Gadol with great wealth. And we say in the Haggadah right after that, V'hi Sha'amdol V'Seinu V'Lanu. And this is what stood us and our forefathers, Sheb'chol Dar V'Dar, in every generation, Oimdim Aleinu L'Chal Eseinu, they come and rise up against it, V'Kadosh Baruch Hu Matzileinu Miyodam. And the Rebbeinu Shalom saves us from our oppressors. What's the V'hi Sha'amdal L'Vaytzeinu? And this is what stands for us. Sheb'chol Dar V'Dar. There was the Bris Bein Absorim. That was something that was mentioned to Avram Avinu. There was Mitzrayim. So what is Sheb'chol Dar V'Dar? What is V'hi Sha'amdal L'Vaytzeinu V'Lanu? What is this that exists in every generation? Wasn't that something that it was in a particular point in time? It was a Bris Bein Absorim to Avram Avinu. It was the Yetzias Mitzrayim. What's Sheb'chol Dar V'Dar? Oimdim Aleinu L'Chal Eseinu. The Meforshim, the Ramban, the Shibboleth Leket, the Ritva, they explain and show in great detail that in the Bris Bein Absorim that was mentioned to Avram Avinu, it was merumas in that Bris Bein Absorim that there will be not only the Shibud of Mitzrayim, but all Dalet Golias. All of the exiles and the Shibud that Klal Yisrael would face from that time onward ad Bias Goyal were all merumas in the Bris Bein Absorim. And they say that it was merumas not only the Golus, but the geula, the redemption as well. That there will be a redemption from the shibud of Mitzrayim. Similarly, there will be a golus, future golus, dalet golius. There will be a redemption, and and afterwards they will go out and be redeemed with great wealth. And that's the promise. That's the promise that was made to Avraham Avinu. That's the covenant. That's the bris. There will be a shibud. There will be a golus, but there will be a geula. There will be a redemption. And and that's what sustains us. That's what sustains us throughout the golus. I had the great schus. To be the machnas eirach for Harav Goyen of Simcha Wasserman Zecher Tzaddik V'Kodesh Levrocha. When he used to come to Toronto, so he stayed by me, and true to his refined midas and his great character, he stayed by me and he continued coming to me. Whether it was fitting for him or it was roy for him, didn't matter. Al Yishan Adam, he lived with the Mamorei Chazal. So I had the great schus, and my family had the great schus to have Rav Simcha stay by us many occasions, Shabbosim, and children grew up in his presence. And it was a window. It was a window to a world that was. He was, of course, the son of Rav Elchanan Wasserman Zatzal. He was the nephew of Rav Chaim Oizer. He was the Talmud of the Chafetz Chaim. The son of Rav Elchanan, the nephew of Rav Chaim Oizer, the Talmud of the Chafetz Chaim, a window to that world of the Gedolim of that world. So Rav Simcha said the following pshat. He told me, I heard it directly from him, he said the following pshat. V'hi she'amda lo eseinu v'lanu. So he said that most people learn and say, V'hi she'amda, that the bris, that there was a golus and there be a geula. And then they will go out, they will be redeemed. Berchush Godel. Said Rav Simcha, V'hi she'amda, what was it that promise and what sustained us? It was the fact, what sustained us was the shibud, not only the geula. What sustained us was the shibud, and then the geula, and the geula berchush godol. What's the meaning of that? What sustained Klal Yisrael throughout all this long, hard golus? What sustained us was, on one hand, was the shibud. Because without the shibud, without the oppression, chas v'shalom, we would be assimilated amongst the goyim. One of the brachas that we had was the shibud. The fact that there was that distance, the fact that there were Rahman al-Islam, some of the gzeras, that sustained us. Not to assimilate, not to adopt and adapt to the culture to the extent that we incorporate their ideology, their customs, their way of thinking, their way of life. That shibud, that sustained us. But there's a time for the shibud, there's a time for the redemption. And there's a time for redemption of Berchush Godol. And the Rabbi Shalom redeems us and gives us the great riches. And that's part of the Hishamda. Because the Berchush Godol gives us the ability to rebuild. It gives us the ability to rebuild and build Torah and rebuild Klal Yisrael. And that's the cycle of the Golus, is the shibud on one hand to distance ourselves from the host culture, and then on the other hand the Geula B'Chush Gadol, to rebuild Torah and rebuild Klal Yisrael. And both of those aspects, V'hi Sha'amda, is both of those aspects. That's the bris, the promise, the covenant that sustained us through this whole long goal ad bias goyal. Both elements. Our Simchas father, Rav Elchanan, says in Kaivetz Ma'amorim, he said the principal reason that in his time, the principal reason that they had the terrible Shrekler Gezeres was because the Yidden started to assimilate and adopt the ideology of the host culture. And because of that, that's the Gezeres, the terrible Shrekler started to come. That's what sustains us through the Golus. The Chush Gadol is also a necessary component. And we asked several times, Klal Yisrael came out of Mitzrayim. They came out with all kinds of wealth. They went and they had Kriyas Yamsus, the great nace of Kriyas Yamsus. They had all this even greater wealth. And what happened? There is the Chet of the Egel, the terrible Chet of the Egel, which was influenced by, to a large degree, because of this wealth. What should have been the reaction to Klal Yisrael with this wealth? The takana, the tikkun, should have been and was. The takana for the Egel was the building of the Mishkan, the Nadavas, Yichuli Truma. They should have taken this wealth, and ultimately they did. Yichuli Truma, take the Truma, and give Nadavas to the Mishkan. Be Mekadosh Shem Shamayim. Be Mekadosh Shem Shamayim. Build a Mishkan. Build Klal Yisrael. Build Torah. Build Hashavua Hashchina. That's ultimately what they did. They stumbled on the way. But the Rebbeinu Shalom gives a Chush Gadol to be an Am Hashem, to show the majesty of the Rebbeinu Shalom, the glory of the Rebbeinu Shalom, the Hakaras HaTov of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and rebuild Klal Yisrael. Yaakov Avinu, it says that he came to Shechem after the encounter with Lavan, after the encounter with Esav. You say in the Haggadah, an integral part of the Haggadah is a Rami Avid Avi. After all those encounters, he came to Shechem. Chazal say he was masakin three things. Vayava Shalom Yishchem. He came Shalom Yishchem. He came to Shechem. He was complete. He was whole. Chazal said he was masakin three things. He is masakin a matbeya, minted a coin. He is masakin marchotzois and shvakim. The Shloah Kodesh says, Yaakov Avinu came Shalom. He was redeemed. He was saved. He was saved from the encounter with Lavan, with Esav. He was Shalom begufay. He was Shalom b'teirasa. He was Shalom b'moinai. He was saved and restored and complete in his wealth, in his Torah, in his physically. He made takanas masakin in Shechem. Why did he make takanas dafka now? Why were these tikkunim named dafka now? Because after he was redeemed and he was saved, so he now was masakin. He made a takana. He showed his hakaras HaTov. He showed the majesty of the Rabbeinu Shalom, the greatness of the Rabbeinu Shalom. The Rabbeinu Shalom saved him, restored him. He did for others. He was masakin. He was masakin matbeya, shalom b'mamayna. So he minted a coin. He was masakin merchatzois for the goof, shalom begufay, and shvakim chachma b'chutz tarayna. When the Rabbeinu Shalom bestows on us brachas, when the Rabbeinu Shalom redeems us. When the Rabbi Shalom redeems us, the answer is, the takana is to give. The takana is to give. To show our gratitude to the Rabbi Shalom, to show that we're all dependent, everything is dependent on the Rabbi Shalom, and to give to others, and to do for others. To build Torah, to build Klal Yisrael. And in this time that we're living, that we question what is going on in this time of COVID. Why is this all this sentiment, this anti-charedi sentiment? Maybe we should in addition to everything else that we examine and question. Maybe we should question whether we are not being influenced by the host culture. Maybe we're not. Maybe we are getting too close to the host culture. Maybe it's creeping in to our lives, into our moisdas, into our way of life. Maybe that influence, the ideology, the way of life, the yachas to olam haza, maybe it is creeping in to our lives, even into the Kodesh HaKadosh Chas v'Sholom. Maybe we should also question how we're dealing with the brachas that the Rabbeinu Shalom give us. Are we doing it and dealing with it the way we're supposed to? Are we dealing with it and using it the way the Rabbeinu Shalom meant it to be used? And as Rav Chanan said in Kavos Ma'amorim, the principal reason for why there are Gezeiros Chas v'Sholom Rachmana litzlan is because we adopt the ideology of the host culture, whether it is in our way of thinking, our way of lives, or the way we utilize and use the brachas that the Rabbeinu Shalom gives us. Just to be Messiah with a very famous Maisa. Many of you probably have heard this Maisa, but it's worth repeating. With the great Mir Rosh Yeshiva Zatzal Rav Nosson C. Finkel. The CEO of Starbucks, former CEO Howard Schultz, he paid a visit to Eretz Yisrael. And one of the stops that he made was the Mir Yeshiva, largest yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael. So he wanted to pay a visit and see the Rosh Yeshiva. And probably imagine that the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of this largest yeshiva, the largest Torah institution in Eretz Yisrael, was probably a young, dynamic, vibrant person. And probably the type of people CEOs that he's encountered, lahavdil, that are full of energy, etc., and physically fit and strong. And then he was waiting there for the Rosh Yeshiva, and the Rosh Yeshiva came in, and the group over there, that entourage, was in shock, because, of course, Rav Nosson Tzvi could hardly walk, and every step and every word that he uttered out of his mouth was with great, enormous pain, and couldn't imagine that the head of the largest yeshiva was someone who was afflicted with this terrible disease, these terrible yisurim. So the Rosh Yeshiva asked them if they heard about the Holocaust. And they said, yes, of course. So he asked them, what lesson did you learn from the Holocaust? What did you take out of your study of the Holocaust? And the answer they gave was never again. Never again. That the Jewish people never again would allow such a thing to happen. We have to be strong. We have to be wealthy. We have to have representation in Congress and the Senate, etc. The Jewish people, never again. We can't let this happen. So the Rosh Yeshiva smiled. Never again, as if it's in our hands. So he said he took out another lesson from the Holocaust. And he said the lesson that he took from the Holocaust was that those people who suffered so terribly, that these terrible Yisurim, if they emerged from that suffering, and we can't judge, but if they emerged from that suffering and they were only concerned about themselves and their own well-being, then they were lowered down to a very low base level. But those people who emerged from that suffering and had the capacity to give and care to others, they became greater people than they ever would have been without the Holocaust. Those people who were given a blanket, and in their cold and suffering, and through that torture, if they were capable of sharing that blanket with 6 other people, even though they were starving, even though they were cold and hungry and tortured, those tortured souls rose so much higher than they ever could have. Va'avodim ve'inu isam arba me'eshana. Rabbi Shalom, he has his bris with us, his promise, his covenant, that we will be his people eternally. Sometimes he has to separate us from what's around us and insulate us, and sometimes it doesn't come easily. When that redemption comes, even in the earliest stages, we have to ask ourselves, are we capable of sharing that blanket with 6 other peoples when we are so deprived? And that is the challenge. We shall be zoich to live up to the challenges and witness the ultimate redemption, b'vias goyel b'mehira,